There's a particular kind of failure in war that doesn't announce itself. No dramatic collapse. No catastrophic encirclement. Just a slow, quiet hemorrhage. Resources pouring into a position that looks like a victory on the map, but functions like an open wound in the ledger. Novorossiysk, a Soviet port city on the Black Sea, became exactly that kind of wound for the German Wehrmacht in 1942. They captured it, they held it, and it bled them for over a year, without ever giving them what they came for. Here's what I want you to think about before we go any further. If you were a commanding general, and you seized a critical port, but couldn't actually use it, would you hold it anyway, hoping the situation improved? Or would you cut your losses early and redirect those forces somewhere they could make a difference? Be honest. What would you do? Drop your answer in the comments, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why neither option was as simple as it sounds. Let's go back to the summer of 1942. The Eastern Front is about to split in two, and one of the most consequential miscalculations of the entire war is already in motion. To understand what happened at Novorossiysk, you have to stop looking at the map the way most people do, as a contest over colored territory. Instead, you need to read it the way a logistics officer would, in terms of tonnage, fuel capacity, port depth, rail connections, flow. By mid-1942, Germany's war machine was consuming resources at a rate that its industrial base could sustain only if new sources of raw material, specifically oil, were captured. The Caucasus region, deep in the Soviet South, held the answer. The oil fields around Baku, Grozny, and Maykop. Without that petroleum, the Wehrmacht's mechanized advantage, the very thing that made Blitzkrieg possible, had an expiration date. Operation Blue, launched in the summer of 1942, was designed to solve that problem, but it did something strategically dangerous. It split the German offensive effort into two divergent axes. Army Group B drove east towards Stalingrad, tasked with anchoring the northern flank along the Volga. Army Group A drove south into the Caucasus, tasked with seizing the oil. Novorossiysk sat at the intersection of these ambitions, not as a glamorous prize, but as a functional node. It was the northernmost operational Soviet port on the eastern Black Sea coast in that sector. It could move troops, fuel, ammunition, and heavy equipment by sea. More critically, it was the gateway to the coastal corridor, connecting the Caucasus front with Soviet naval supply lines. The ports of Poti and Batumi, further south along the Georgian coast, were the endpoints. But Novorossiysk was the lock on the door. If the Germans could seize and operate that port, two things would happen simultaneously. First, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet would lose its advanced logistics hub, effectively confining it to secondary ports far from the active front. Second, the western flank of any German advance into the Caucasus would be secured. Without controlling that flank, any deep penetration toward Baku was exposed, dangerously, to counterattacks rolling down from the coast. One city, two operational problems solved. That was the theory. The 17th Army, under General Richard Ruoff, received the mission, and in the initial weeks, it looked like the theory might hold. The advance through the Kuban steppe in August 1942 was, on the surface, impressive. The partial collapse of the Soviet front in that sector allowed the 5th Corps and supporting Romanian divisions to push south at a pace that suggested the campaign might be decided quickly. Towns fell, defensive lines buckled. The arrows on the German situation maps swept confidently toward the coast. But that speed was deceptive, and it concealed a problem that would define everything that followed. The logistics network behind the advancing troops was stretching faster than it could sustain. This wasn't a sudden crisis. It was an incremental degradation. Fuel deliveries for armored vehicles began arriving late, not by hours, but by days. Artillery ammunition stocks thinned. Mechanical spare parts became scarce. Each additional kilometer of advance added friction to a supply chain that was already operating near its limits. This is a pattern that repeats across military history, and it carries a specific operational consequence. When your logistics degrade gradually, you don't lose the ability to advance. You lose the ability to advance decisively. You can still push forward. You can still take ground, but you can no longer execute the rapid envelopments and encirclements that destroy enemy forces. Instead, you displace them. You push them back intact, and they regroup, reorganize, and prepare the next defensive line. That is precisely what happened on the road to Novorossiysk. The Soviet forces falling back through the Kuban were battered, but they were not destroyed. They retained enough organizational coherence to establish defensive positions around the city. And by the time German forces arrived at the outskirts in September 1942, the window for a swift, overwhelming assault had narrowed considerably. The attack on Novorossiysk began with urban penetration into the western and northern sectors of the city. German units fought through streets and industrial blocks, methodically pushing toward the port and the shoreline of Thames Bay, the deep natural harbor that gave the city its strategic value. And they succeeded. Partially, the western side of the bay fell under German control. The port infrastructure, cranes, docks, warehouses, was physically in their hands. On a map, it looked like a captured objective, but maps don't shoot artillery. Here is where the campaign's central failure crystallized, not in a dramatic defeat, but in an incomplete victory that was operationally worse than either a clean success or clear withdrawal. The Germans held the western shore of Thames Bay. The Soviets held the eastern shore. The distance between them, across the water, was short enough for direct artillery fire. Every dock, every crane, every square meter of the port facility was within range of Soviet guns positioned on the opposite bank. Any vessel attempting to enter or maneuver within the harbor would be under sustained, observed fire. The port was captured in form but denied in function. The Germans possessed the physical infrastructure of a major logistics hub and could not move a single supply ship through it. This was the exact outcome the entire operation had been designed to prevent. The strategic logic of taking Novorossiysk rested entirely on using it as a supply node, as a naval denial point, as a base for controlling the eastern Black Sea. Without operational use of the port, the city became a liability rather than an asset. It required garrisoning. It required supplying. It consumed the very resources it was supposed to generate. The reason for this incomplete capture was not solely Soviet resistance, though the defenders fought with organized tenacity. The deeper cause was exhaustion. The units that reached Novorossiysk had burned through a significant portion of their offensive capability during the advance through the Kuban. They lacked the surplus combat power needed to execute an amphibious crossing of the bay or a flanking maneuver around the eastern shore. They had enough strength to enter the city. They did not have enough to close it. What followed was a stabilization of the front line inside the city itself, running through a series of massive concrete industrial complexes, most notably the cement factories known as Proletary and Oktyabr. These structures became the defining terrain of a siege within a siege. Reinforced concrete, multiple floors, internal compartmentalization that broke combat down to the level of squads clearing individual rooms. Artillery was difficult to employ with precision without collapsing positions occupied by your own troops. The German assault units, trained and doctored for mobile warfare, for speed and maneuver, found themselves locked in a grinding, room-by-room attrition for which their entire operational philosophy was poorly suited. And the casualties began to accumulate, not in dramatic spikes, but in a slow, steady drain. This is, and here's something most people don't intuitively grasp, more corrosive to a fighting force than a single catastrophic engagement. A massive battle generates urgency. Reinforcements are rushed forward. Losses are replaced. But a slow bleed? It empties units gradually, without triggering the institutional alarm bells that mobilize reserves. Divisions that were combat effective in September became hollow shells by December, not because of a single disaster, but because of 100 small ones, day after day, week after week. Let me ask you something here. Have you ever been in a situation, in work and life, where you committed to something that wasn't failing spectacularly enough to justify quitting, but wasn't succeeding enough to justify continuing? That gray zone where you just keep investing because stopping feels like admitting defeat? If so, tell me about it in the comments, because that psychological trap is exactly what was happening at the operational level in Novorossiysk. The winter of 1942 to 1943 froze the stalemate in place. Both sides lacked the capacity for decisive action in the sector, but the winter affected the Germans more acutely. Their ground transport network through the Kuban was more vulnerable to weather disruption than the Soviet rail system, feeding the Caucasus from the east. Supplies arrived thinner, slower, less predictably. And then, in February 1943, the strategic floor collapsed, not at Novorossiysk, but 1,000 kilometers to the north. The surrender of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad was not merely a tactical catastrophe of enormous scale. It was a fundamental rupture of the operational balance of the entire Eastern Front. The northern anchor of the German position was gone. The flank that was supposed to protect Army Group A's deep penetration into the Caucasus no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The consequence was immediate and stark. Army Group A, which had reached its deepest points of advance in the Caucasus, was now at risk of being cut off entirely if Soviet forces exploited the gap left by Stalingrad. The decision was made to withdraw the bulk of Army Group A northward into the Kuban bridgehead, a defensive perimeter anchored on the Taman Peninsula and including Novorossiysk. The withdrawal was executed with reasonable tactical efficiency, but it fundamentally transformed the nature of the position. The Kuban bridgehead was no longer a launching pad for offensive operations into the Caucasus. It was a holding position, a defensive perimeter maintained to protect the crossing at the Kerch Strait, the narrow waterway connecting the Kuban to Crimea. The Germans had gone from chasing oil fields to defending an exit door. The Soviet command recognized the vulnerability, and they exploited it with an operation that was modest in scale but disproportionate in effect. In February 1943, Soviet naval infantry and marine units executed an amphibious landing on the southern shore of Seams Bay, in a sector called Malaya Zemlya, which translates directly as small land. The name was almost ironic. The beachhead was tiny in territorial terms, but its operational impact was enormous. The landing site was chosen carefully. It threatened the flank and rear of German forces inside the city without requiring a direct crossing of the bay under fire. Its mere existence forced the Germans to divert units from other sectors of the perimeter to contain it, fragmenting a defensive line that was already stretched thin. The Germans launched multiple operations to eliminate the beachhead. Each one failed, and each failure cost men, ammunition, and, most critically, time. Every soldier committed to reducing Malaya Zemlya was the soldier not available to hold the main perimeter of the Kuban bridgehead. The beachhead held for months. Resupply by sea was difficult, dangerous, and sometimes interrupted, but it never stopped entirely. Malaya Zemlya became a permanent pressure point, a splinter lodged in the German defensive structure that could not be removed and could not be ignored. Meanwhile, the Soviets were steadily gaining air superiority over the region. The Luftwaffe, overstretched across the entire Eastern Front, could no longer guarantee tactical air support for ground operations in the Kuban or effectively interdict Soviet naval resupply. The German logistics chain, dependent on ferrying supplies across the Kerch Strait from Crimea, operated under increasing friction, not severed, but constricted, each crossing a little more dangerous than the last. In September 1943, the Soviets launched their final operation to retake Novorossiysk. It was a coordinated, multi-axis assault, an amphibious strike directly into the port executed under cover of darkness, a ground offensive pressing from the north, and a simultaneous breakout from the Malaya Zemlya beachhead. The convergence from three directions simultaneously made it impossible for the defenders to concentrate their response. The city was recaptured over several days of intense urban combat. German forces executed an initial withdrawal that was tactically orderly, but left significant material behind. The evacuation of the entire Kuban bridgehead followed in October 1943. German and Romanian forces crossed the Kerch Strait into Crimea, arriving depleted, exhausted, and stripped of heavy equipment that could not be ferried across in time. Over a year of fighting, thousands of casualties on both sides, enormous expenditures of fuel, ammunition, and irreplaceable trained personnel. And the final result was a return to the starting line, minus the forces consumed along the way. The strategic audit of Novorossiysk is quietly devastating. The objective was correct. A functioning port on the Black Sea coast would have transformed the German position in the Caucasus. But correct objective and achievable objective are not the same thing, and the failure to distinguish between them is one of the most consistent patterns in military miscalculation. The port was captured but never used. The position was held but never exploited. The forces committed were substantial but never sufficient. And while divisions bled slowly in the concrete ruins of cement factories on the shore of Tsemes Bay, the war center of gravity was shifting to Stalingrad, to Kursk, to the Dnieper, places where those same divisions might have altered outcomes that mattered far more. Novorossiysk didn't destroy an army the way Stalingrad did. It didn't produce a dramatic turning point. It simply consumed resources, month after month, in the service of a strategic logic that had already expired. And perhaps that is the most dangerous kind of failure, the one that never looks catastrophic enough to force a reckoning, until the bill finally arrives and there is nothing left to pay it with. What do you think? Is it harder to recover from a sudden catastrophe, or from a slow drain that you never fully acknowledged? I'd genuinely like to know your answer. This has been Noctel. Stay curious.